So we've already talked about Africa, all throughout West Africa. We have references. Now here's kind of the juicy thing for black people. I think this is that Ephraim and Manasseh are said to be double inheritors of the blessing. The children of Joseph, they're double inheritors. So they become, they inherit a double portion. In West Africa, there are claims of descent from them. So really, the claim of, if black people wanted to identify with, lost tribes and ancient Jewish practice and all of that stuff, they don't have to, there doesn't have to be this resorting to this, like, we're the real Jews and those are the fake Jews. This is ridiculous. Like, first of all, what an exalted position historically, way back in the day, that, you could be like, wow, Ephraim and Manasseh, like, that's the sons of Joseph. Like, that, like, they were in a better position than everybody else. And the claims are that they seem to have gone to the regions of West Africa. So, which then now we're going to get to a reason. I'm going to jump ahead. So why did different tribes go to different places? One could argue that it's because the different tribes looked different. And that they were different tribes in every sense of what a different tribe meant. And the concept of tribe in the Torah is like the concept of tribe in pre-colonial Africa. Very much like, it's not at all like when we think of tribes. Like today, a lot of times we think about tribes, even like in Libya, we talk about the tribes that allied with Gaddafi. We talk about tribes in Jordan or in Yemen or anything. And there's just a million tribes, and it's really just somebody tracing to a patriarch, and that's it. But the tribes that are indicated in the Torah initially have different plots of land in Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because they were distinctly different cultures that were not going to get along right away. So the one rule that racialists like to point out is they say during the period of the Exodus there wasn't allowed to be tribal intermarriage. So they say, aha! But this was a practical reason, because as soon as they got settled, there was. Not just that it happened, but it was allowed. The rule was off. It was just for this period, because if you're saying, there's a logistical problem. If you're saying God has ordained this plot for this tribe, this plot for this tribe, this plot for this tribe, then you got to get there first and give those tribes those. You can't then, well, there's this guy and he's 20 now, and he's half from this tribe and half from that tribe. Now you've just got a problem in terms of allocating land. If you've already made peace between these tribes by allocating land, you have to say, okay, intermarriage, cool, but not till we get there. Just for logistical reasons, not for spiritual reasons, not for racialistic reasons, or anything like that. So, more than likely, you guys gonna come sit down, or?
Oh, I'm just getting some water.
All right.
I'm gonna go back on the internet.
Right on. More than likely, these groups, Ephraim and Manasseh, as the sons of Joseph, who we know married an Egyptian woman, and it was probably, pretty dark himself to begin with. These tribes would have probably identified with traders, merchants and stuff coming through that were from, regions of Africa and eventually West Africa. So I would argue, and this gets to your question directly, well, and then some actually, why different tribes migrated to different places might have been based on having some cultural similarities and perhaps even appearances with, and we know that the northern tribes, well, anyway, I don't want to get into too much of that. One of the tribes, one thing that's very interesting, one of the tribes that disappears from the proto-Christian account of Revelation, it disappears from the listing. They just list Ephraim and Manasseh as the 12, it makes the whole 12. They leave out Dan. This tells us something about the author. The author no longer considered Dan savable. So the author had an idea. Of course the author had an idea who the tribes were. because this is supposed to be Mashiach job, Mashiach work, to find these tribes and bring them back in. So if he's saying Jesus, the son of Joseph, is more than likely Mashiach ben Yosef is who they saw, because there were the dual messiahs of the Essenes, and also in the Talmud, Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, or David. So more than likely he's seeing this guy as Mashiach ben Yosef. And proto-Christian, we don't have the Christian doctrine established yet, church doctrine established yet. So he's saying, I do know who these tribes are, and Dan is unsavable, in his opinion, at that point. Now, what's interesting is throughout Europe, there is this patriarch that is referenced as being named Dan, and having brought civilization to Europe at some ancient point in time, before we have any written records, for which some names derive, like the Danube, Denmark, Danzig, etc., etc. Dane, all of these things traced to an ancient patriarch. So more than likely the author was saying, because of Rome, who he probably saw as being part of that European grouping of the tribe of Dan, he was probably saying these guys are burning the temple, they're doing, leave them out of the list. Whether he did that as a calculated literary decision in composing this book, or whether it was really legitimately part of a vision, and then that's just how he received it. Even how his mind would interpret these tribes, that it can't be. It must be these two tribes that receive the double blessing. They must represent a unique tribe and not Dan, because Dan, no. But historically speaking, though, we can say that Dan is a likely, that this patriarch of Dan that for which stuff is named in Europe is a likely contender for the exiled. Not that the patriarch Dan went there, but that this exiled Danite culture went there. And some people even say Dan dispersed into Ethiopia too. So it could have been just a sort of fan in that direction, in the direction of the West, that sort of scattered out down into Africa, into Ethiopia, where there were, probably existing folks. We know from Midrashic literature that Moses, while he was in his own exile before returning and liberating people, went to Ethiopia. So this is where he met one of his wives, the Cushite wife that he meets, not Zipporah. And some people will say it's the same person, but it seems to be mentioning two different people, But he goes there, he defeats this, evil king, and he becomes the king of Ethiopia. Moses. This is the Midrashic literature, that he's in exile out of Egypt, becomes the king of Ethiopia, and leaves behind his teachings, leaves behind the praising of Yahadu, what people translate as Judaism, but really mitzvahism, the commandmentism, the Torahism. He leaves that behind, in Ethiopia, and then it flourishes. Sheba has some recollection of it. She goes to meet Solomon. They have this, reported in the second Targum of Esther. We have this, and then in the Quran, which is drawing, it's quoting directly, in some cases, and paraphrasing from the second Targum of Esther, this interaction between her and Solomon. And then, of course, she gets pregnant. Long story short, goes back. We got the stuff in the Ethiopian literature, the Keber Nagast, all of this. And Menelik and all of that, and Ethiopian dynasty, and so on and so forth. So, tribe of Dan, and then tribe of Benjamin, and Ephraim and Manasseh, And then people even say stuff like that about the Native Americans, and there's some evidence for that. So, without nailing down each tribe and saying, here's where this one went, which is what I want that 12-volume set to do when I'm older. I want to look at, bring in all the history and say, here's the evidence, and there's some evidence, and you can really, what I've come to see is you can really look at any region of the world and see that these distinct groups seem to have gone everywhere in the world. which is kind of fitting since Midrashic literature suggests or says that Adam was the first Jew, which is kind of funny because it's not a normative position. The normative position is that Abraham was the first Jew. There's a minority position that Moses and the tribes were, but the main majority position is that Abraham is the first patriarch of Judaism, not just an ancestor of Jews, and that he was the first convert to Judaism and brought everybody. Which I heard a funny Indian Jewish comic actually talk about because he came to America. He was from the Indian Jewish community, not Native American, India, and people would say, "Oh, is your mother Jewish?" or is your father, and so they do that whole thing, and basically it was like, "Look, who was the first Jew?" And Abraham, and he's like, because like one of his parents converted or something like that. And he's like, who's the first Jew? Abraham. Were his parents Jewish? No. People, so the first Jew, and he was right. He was trying to make a joke, but it's correct. It's correct. He's correct. History and Jewish history and Halakha is Abraham was the. How can somebody have this notion of there being this thing? What it is, DNA convert? What happened? This wasn't how it was viewed. So what happens is these tribes fan out all over the place, probably based on how they look. What does this tell us about the role of Moses when he was uniting the 12 tribes? 12 was the number of perfection. It was the number of the zodiac. It was the number. It was like saying every tribe in a sense. It was saying he united the 12 tribes of the slave caste. What is the term for slave and working? It was the same thing. So now we've got people like Zahi Hawass and people in the Egyptian Antiquities Department who are like, there were no slaves in Egypt, and we see how they... Well, yeah, there were no slaves in the sense of chattel slavery like we think of it today. But there was slavery in the sense of a caste, a social caste at this point, that had a job to do that could not advance, that had to work that job because it didn't have any other choice, and was treated brutally, would be subjected to even killing, where the people who killed them, beat them, killed them, didn't get in trouble. They had to live in a ghetto even back then. So almost like sharecropping, So it was, in effect, it was slavery. Now, it wasn't like what we think of as the strict definition, but the terminology would be the same either way you translate it. So he unites these 12 tribes of this caste. And along with it, that integrates into all of these groups, this Arab Rob, which, this mixed multitude. And then we see good and bad people from that mixed multitude. We see Caleb is from the mixed multitude, the Arab Rob. And he is granted a portion of, like, right from the start in Judah's portion. Right, so he's literally becomes part of the tribe, from this mixed multitude, becomes part of literally the tribe of Judah, as well as being a general Israelite and general, in religious terms, a Jew. It seems to me that this was we know from Egyptian hieroglyphics that Egypt was composed of people of all different hues and shades. There are hieroglyphics of people with blonde hair and light skin, red hair and light skin, tattoos and light skin, tan, brown, dark black, Nubian looking, all sorts of people, Now, as you go back further, many of the rulers, the kings of Egypt, before the pharaonic system, were very Nubian looking, and that is something that is suppressed sometimes by Egyptology. They want to make it out like everybody was much more Arab looking or even more European looking. But the original founders were, pretty Nubian. But by the time you get to the pharaohs and stuff, you have all sorts of different looking people. And of course, Akhenaten, who we're linking with Moses, is one example. Who's got very sub-Saharan features and very European features, and you'd almost think extraterrestrial features from the way he looks. This idea that there was just, purely, homogenous looking group of Egypt is hogwash. the mission of Moses then united these groups. And just as we were talking about earlier, especially with, with Rashi, he's saying Genesis is the reason why Genesis comes first in the Torah and not the first commandment per se of Exodus, is that it's supposed to serve as a secular history to the nations, to explain the backdrop of everything. So it's explaining where all these people came from, and it's uniting them. It's saying if we trace it back, we all go to Adam. If we trace all of our tribes back, because that's the audience of it, these tribes. We trace it back, we all go to this one guy. Everybody does. So we're all one. But then, even amongst our groups, we all trace back to pretty close to him, to these 12 sons of the, and then even links it to the Arabs and says, of Ishmael, he had 12 sons too, and never disparages him. Says he had the same blessing. He had 12 princes as sons, and so on. And there could be a whole conversation about that. So anyway, I'm gonna round that off and then kick it back to you with saying, yeah, I think along the lines of what I was perceiving you were saying. This notion that literally these lost tribes. The reason why we can't find them is because they've disseminated throughout the entire world population, and just mathematically extrapolating the data of how many people there were then to now, it's absolutely improbable that there would be any human being alive on the earth today that could not have traced some ancestor back to anyone alive back then, pretty much. But certainly to a group this big, I mean, we're talking about millions of people, and then midrashically in Talmudic Judaism, we have the notion of literally 80% of the children of Israel having stayed behind in Egypt. So that huge group was only a tiny chunk, So the fact that there would have been that number, and then all the people who came in later, anyway, it's very clear that that these tribes disseminated throughout the world, culturally, and even in terms of their offspring, which is really not the point. So when there's a talk about tracing things back to some common ancestor, that's because that's how society worked back then. And so these people were tribalists, and so the way to confront that tribalism was to say, look, all of our tribes go back to one guy. Isn't that great? So even though we're all very different tribes, we're all one. And then they're like, oh yeah, that's great, But then what happens is, as soon as they get into Eretz Yisrael, everybody, a lot of people start intermarrying, and those tribes start dissolving. So even while there, we already start seeing the dissolving of those tribal divisions. So kicking it back to you. Camera 2.
There, in Hiram Key, it talks about the Egyptian word for Hebrew, the Egyptian word harabu was the derivative that gave rise to the word Hebrew, meant wandering tribe.
They're sort of right. In Egyptian, in Kemetic, here, camera 1. In Egyptian or Kemetic, the word is apiru, because the B it was pronounced like a P. Apiru. It comes from the Sumerian term haberu. So that's what they're getting it from in that book. Haberu. Now what's really interesting is in the Mesopotamian, Ugaritic sources and so on, we have the Arab tribes, their ancestors being called Urabi, or Urubi in some sources. So this, we could say, wow, those sound a lot alike. It's not coincidence. The term, if we want to say in Hebrew or Arabic that somebody is a Hebrew, it's spelled exactly the same as saying someone's an Arab, except 2 letters are swapped in place. Same in Hebrew and in Arabic. So this idea, and then of course the Arab Rab. The Arab is Arab, you know. So that itself could be a whole discussion, and somehow this is something where people don't notice something that's there, you know, all along. Oh man, I got a lazy cat on my. Let me turn and look at you, because you're so beautiful, Ben.
We're getting low on battery, by the way.
Oh, how low?
It said 20% like 5 minutes ago.
Oh, how low can you go? Hold on, let's see what's happening here. Come on, get that out of there. Okay, let's see. Is there an outlet over there? Probably not. Ben, can you sit over there again?
Yeah, I'll get back over there.
We'll be short. Just plug that. Plug that son of a bitch in there. Okay. Oh, you still got it on me. So what were we saying? Okay, so yeah. So the link isn't coincidence, but the Urubi come down from Samaria, Babylonia, down here. They become known as the Arabs. The Haberu come down this way and into Egypt. And into Egypt they were called the Apiru. And it's not just like, hey, that sounds a lot like our word. It must have come from that. The roots are the same. So in Sumerian and in the Ugaritic accounts, and Ugaritic is a Semitic language, you know, so this isn't surprising. But the term is from the same root. So Haberu, and this could get into a totally different and interesting discussion too. Haberu means to cross, you know, those who cross over. Just like in Hebrew and in Arabic, it means the exact same thing. So why is Abraham called a Hebrew? It's not because of a tribal identity. It's a literal word. There was no tribal identity in his time known as Hebrew. Two people are called a Hebrew at that point. One,